Hi there. We are reading American Miscellany, and here's the first engraving that goes along with essay number 78, Travels in the Holy Land. So this first engraving is entitled Present Appearance of Jerusalem. So we've been reading this lovely book called American Miscellany. It was published in 1865, and it is a collection of essays. We've just finished our last essay, number 77, on moral character of the monkey. And so we're moving on to read another installment by Miss Harriet Martineau of her travels in the Holy Land. So we're here on page 185. Once again, that's essay number 78. And let's go ahead and enjoy Travels in the Holy Land number 5 by Harriet Martineau. Our last view of Jerusalem was very fine. We looked back from a ridge on the northern road and saw it lying, bright and stately, on its everlasting hills, but it looked lower than most other points of view, from the Moab mountains forming its lofty background. We descended the slope before us and lost sight of the holy city forever. Again we were struck with the vivid coloring of the scenery. All this day the hills were dressed in brilliant hues, the soil red, gray, and brown, the tilled portions of the brightest green, and the shadows purple or lilac. All the hills show traces of having been once terraced, and they were still completely so in the neighborhood of our encampment this evening, the terraces following the strata of the stone, which all lay slanting. This gives a singular air of wildness to the most cultivated spots. Here and there were basins among the hills, the red soil dropped all over with fig and olive trees, or full of corn, and the upland tracks winding among slopes all strewn with cistus, iris, cyclamen, and anemones, and bristling with tall, flowering hollyhocks. I guess that's hollyhocks, but it's only spelled with one H. On we went, past deep old wells, yawning in the hollows, or stone cisterns where the cattle were crowding to drink, past a few camels here and there, browsing in the dells, past groups of Arabs with their asses, carrying corn to the city, past stone villages crowning the steeps, till at 6 p.m. we encamped beside a beautiful old pool. We were under the shelter of a rock whose moist crevices were fringed with delicate ferns. While dinner was preparing, I went back on our road, the narrow stony road which wound round the verdant promontory opposite to our rock, to find a honeysuckle which I had seen climbing and blossoming to a great height, and I brought back a charming handful of flowers. While we were at dinner in the tent, a sound of scuffling was heard outside, and when our dragoman next entered, he was out of breath. We afterward heard the whole story, and were amused to find how zealous our Mohammedan servants could be in the cause of Christians. Some Arabs with their loaded mules had come with the intention of encamping beside the pool, and on finding the ground partly occupied, though there was plenty of room left, they became abusive and wondered aloud what business these cursed Christians had in their country. Our dragoman resented this and threw the speaker down over the tent ropes. There was then a stout scuffle, and our cook coming to help, and the Arabs falling one upon another over the tent pegs in the dark. They had the worst of it, and went off vowing vengeance. We heard no more of them, however. The next morning we saw the Mediterranean like a basin of deep blue water between two hills. We were not going toward it, however, but to Neblona, the ancient Sychar, where lies that Jacob's well, at which the woman of Samaria was wont to draw water. Our road lay through a moist, fertile valley, now called Hawara, where the crops were splendid for miles, and the villages were thickly planted on the hills. The ground rose in a series of tablelands, of which there was a succession of 3, when we were leaving the rich Hawara valley. The roads in this part of the Holy Land were mere lanes full of stones between walls, or tracks running through olive grounds and meadows, or paths running along shelves of the rocks, with a bit of rocky staircase at each end, about ascending or descending, which our good horses made no difficulty. Before we get too far, let's go ahead and take a look at this next engraving. It's called Terrace Cultivation. Before entering the valley where old Sychar lay between the mountains Ebal and Gerizim, we came to the fine fertile parcel of ground which Jacob bought. The valley opens out into this wide basin, and near the junction of the valley and the basin is the old well, which is the supposed scene of the conversion of Jesus with the Samaritan woman. Some of our party wound round the base of the hill to the well, and some, and I for one, rode by the upper path over the shoulder of the hill and came down on the other side. I had thus a fine view of the whole locality, of the valley where the city lies, a narrow valley, rich with fig and olive groves, and overhung by the rocky bases of Ebal and Gerizim, where the square black entrances of tombs dotted the strata of the rocks. From this height Jacob's land looked a beautiful expanse. The well is a mere rough heap of stones, with a hole in the middle nearly closed up. What there is below ground I cannot say, but this is all that is to be seen on the surface. It is not a well likely to be in use now, for there are many springs and shallow cisterns, though no well, between this and the town, which lies about 1.5 miles off. All right. Before we get into the next paragraph, let's go ahead and take a look at this next engraving. It's called Mosata Ebal and Gerizim. Mounts Ebal and Gerizim. Hopefully you can see that. Ebal and Gerizim. Okay. Gerizim. Everybody knows that the Jews had no friendly dealings with the Samaritans in the time of Jesus. The quarrel had then lasted above 500 years. How many sons had gone down upon their wrath? The Samaritans had wished to assist the Jews in rebuilding the temple of Jerusalem, but the Jews hated them as a mixed race and would not admit that they had any right to share in temple worship or any Jewish privileges. It really was a most serious objection to the Samaritans that they were of a mixed race, not only because the Jews believed that they held the promises on the very ground of the purity of their race, but because the intermarriages of the former Samaritan Israelites with Assyrians and others disposed them to idolatry, or at least to a worship as mixed as their race. So the Samaritans were excluded from the rebuilding of the temple above 500 years BC, and not being permitted to help, they did all they could to hinder. About 100 years later, they obtained leave from the Persian court to which both the Jews and they were subject, to build a second temple to Jehovah, and they built it on Mount Gerizim. This was a shocking impiety in the sight of the Jews, and it was the occasion of a number of lax-minded Jews who had broken the law by marrying heathen wives or otherwise, and who yet wished to worship Jehovah in the temple, resorting to Sychar to join the Samaritans, and reduce their race yet more mixed. And to join the Samaritans and render their race yet more mixed. This was the quarrel which the woman of Samaria referred to when she spoke of the question whether men ought to worship in this mountain or in Jerusalem. And thus is explained her wonder that Jesus, being a Jew, should ask water of her who was a Samaritan. There was also a quarrel about their scriptures, the Jews insisting to this day that the Samaritans had altered 2 or 3 texts relating to these 2 mountains, Ebal and Gerizim, in their own sacred copy of the books of Moses, the Samaritans insisting, of course, that theirs was the true copy. From my early youth, I had always taken a strong interest in this old quarrel, feeling sympathy with both parties, and a keen delight in the wise and soothing words of Jesus concerning it. What a truth it was for both parties to hear that God was now to be worshipped everywhere, and that all places were henceforth to be as sacred as the Jerusalem temple, or the mountain at Sychar. And what a lesson is liberality! What a lesson in liberality it was to the Jews when he gave honor to the Samaritan in that parable on account of his good works above the sacred priest and the servant of the temple at Jerusalem. Both parties were, of course, wrong in their fierce anger, but each had much to plead on his own side. The Jews were bound to keep their race and worship pure, and held as an essential matter of faith that Jehovah would have but one dwelling place, which was their view of their temple. And the Samaritans were surely right in persisting in their endeavor to worship Jehovah in accordance with the laws of Moses, as they did not believe in strange gods, and if the Jews could not admit them to worship in the temple at Jerusalem, they could not be blamed for building one for themselves. Such was always my view of the matter, and such being my view, it was with indescribable interest that I looked this day upon Mount Gerizim, and remembered that somewhere in the city we were approaching was treasured that sacred copy of the Samaritan Pentateuch, books of Moses, which the possessors believed to be the true one, and to be 3,500 years old. The most learned men among the Christians do not believe it to be nearly so old as that, but they have a high opinion of its value, and would follow it sooner than any other, I believe, excepting instances where the disputed texts about Ebal and Gerizim are concerned. The present inhabitants of the city hate the Christians as heartily as the old inhabitants used to hate the Jews. The present inhabitants are Mohammedans, of the most bigoted character, and they would admit neither Jews nor Christians within their gates till within a few years, when the government of the country, then Egyptian, compelled them to better manners. They dared not refuse us admission, but they behaved with great insolence. We had to ride from end to end of the city, our tents being pitched on a green on the other side. Our horse had to go as slowly as possible through the narrow street, which would not hold 2 abreast, and was paved with large slippery stones. As we rode along, one behind another, at this funereal pace, all the people came out to stare, and many to mock. 3 times things were thrown in my face. Men and women laughed and sneered, and children thrust out their tongues. I have felt what a lesson this was to intolerance about matters of opinion. These people hold a faith which is very noble and beautiful. Few of us know how noble and beautiful is the Mohammedan faith, and there is no need to say what their visitors thought of the Christian faith as they hold it. And yet, what a scene of hatred and misunderstanding was here. And thus it is, but too often, in the streets of other cities, where men ought to know better than to despise each other for worshipping the same God in a different manner. In the streets of other cities, men take upon themselves to pity and despise one another, with no better knowledge in reality of one another's views and feelings than these Mohammedans had of ours, or we of theirs. At last we were through, and glad I was to issue from the gate at the further end. But a sad sight awaited us there. A company of lepers were under the trees, crying to us for charity, and stretching out their maimed hands. It was a terrible sight, and which we see too often in that country. It saddened us at Jerusalem almost every day. Our tents were pitched on a weedy plot of ground, among gardens, orchards, and rippling streams, and looking up to Ebal on the one side and Gerizim on the other. Ebal is still the sterner-looking mountain of the two, but Gerizim has lost much of its fertility. Both have tombs and votive buildings in them, which show them to have been places of pilgrimage. After dinner we ascended a height past the Mohammedan cemetery, whence we had a fine view, in this last sunlight, of this most beautiful city. It was once the capital of Samaria, and it is still, and must ever be, from its situation, a very striking place. It completely fills the valley from side to side, and ascends a little way up the skirts of Gerizim. Its houses, with their flat white roofs, are hedged in by the groves which surround the town. Vines spread from roof to roof, and from court to court. 2 or 3 palms spring up in the midst, and higher aloft still, a grateful minaret here and there. Then, to my delight, we descended to seek the Samaritan synagogue. We were guided to it, and I saw nearly all the Samaritans of the place, good-looking people. The men were wearing the high helmet-like turbans, which we see in the portraits of Josephus and other old Jews. They said their number was 60 at this place, and about 40 more elsewhere, only 100 in the whole world. They declared their chief priest and the rest of their sect to be at Genoa. They kept 3 great feasts in the year, going up to Gerizim as the Jews used to go up to the temple. The synagogue was a small, ordinary-looking chapel within a curtained recess of which is kept the old copy of the Pentateuch. It was shown to us after some entreaty on our part, but I found it impossible that I could be allowed to touch it. I felt it a great event to have seen it. It was written on a sort of vellum in the Samaritan text, clear, small, and even. The vellum is tattered, but it is well mounted on parchment. The priest himself dares not touch the manuscript without careful purification, and he holds it by the ends of the rollers on which it is fixed as a scroll, like the copies of the Jewish law in synagogues. We were lighted through the archways of the street on our way home, and down the hill by a single candle which burned steadily in the still air. Our employment this evening was reading aloud the history of the Jewish and Samaritan controversy and the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John. When we were thus reading in our text, the jackal was in full cry on the slopes of Gerizim. We passed the night after the 14th of April in our tents, just outside the town of Jenin. Our dragomen had warned us of the thievish character of the people of this neighborhood, so that we had an eye to such of our property as was lying about us while the tents were preparing. The governor called, had coffee, and appointed 4 guards, so that we supposed ourselves safe from robbery. But in the morning the best mule was gone, and the 4 guards declared themselves wholly unable to say when, how, and by whom the animal was set loose from its fastenings and carried off. Our departure was delayed, the governor was sent for, and a pretended inquiry was made, and this gave me opportunity to walk about for an hour after breakfast, through the little town, through an orange grove where every tree was white with blossom, and up a neighboring hill, whence I saw, to my surprise, a snowy mountain peak to the northeast. This was the summit of Gebel Sheikh, the mountain which closes in the north. This was the summit of Gebel Sheikh, the mountain which closes in the north end of the valley of the Jordan, and then joins onto the range of Antilobanus. From my point of view, I could see, too, the beautiful plain of Esdraelon, which we were to traverse this day, and the hill to the north which enclosed Nazareth, where we hoped to sleep this night, and to the west some tokens on the rise of a line of hills which we should soon see swelling into Mount Carmel, where we were to go tomorrow. What a prospect lay before both eye and mind. Our dragoman told us we might make ourselves comfortable about our mule. He had no doubt it was in some stable in the town. Our dragoman told us we might make ourselves easy about our mule. He had no doubt it was in some stable in the town. We should be asked to leave a muleteer behind, and in a day or two the animal would be delivered to him, with a demand of a few piastres for the trouble of finding the mule on the mountains. It is probable that matters stood exactly so, for the muleteer followed in 2 days with the beast, having paid 14 piastres for the trouble of finding it. Thus far we had traveled only among hills and among valleys, and today we heartily enjoyed our ride over the rich plain of Esdraelon. It was fertile and flowery from end to end, and the young partridges ran under the very feet of my horse. Small birds flitted in multitudes on every side, and tall cranes stood among the high grass. The Carmel range grew upon the sight as we had expected, and the blue hills of Galilee closed in the view northward. Little Mount Hermon rose on our sight, and on its north acclivity lay the village of Nain. A round hill, dropped over with old oaks, was Mount Tabor. Villages were well placed on such rising grounds as they were amidst the plain, and our track lay broad, level, and green, among rows of tall artichokes and patches of rich cultivation. When about 2/3 of the way over, we crossed the green caravan track from Egypt to Damascus. We had been to Egypt, and we were going to Damascus, but we did not follow this track. We held on northward to the Galilean hills. We entered among these hills about an hour before we reached Nazareth, winding up and down and round the base of one and the shoulder of another, sometimes among scattered wood, sometimes over stony tracks, and always in sight of many goats. After mounting a very steep pass and coming to a well and winding round a hill once more, we came suddenly in sight of a pretty Nazareth. Its basin of fertility is charming. Its little plain, full of gardens and groves and fields, surrounded, as it seemed, completely by hills. The town is in fact a poor one, but built of stone and covering a good deal of ground, and extending a little way up the western slopes, it looks well from above. All right, let's take a quick break to look at the next engraving. It's called Mount Carmel. This one. Mount Carmel. All right, here then we had before our eyes the scenery amidst which Jesus grew up. Its character cannot have changed very much since his day. A fertile basin among the everlasting hills and the primitive little town which they protect must bear much the same aspect from age to age. The great addition is the convent and church of the Latin monks, but these buildings do not stand out offensively to the eye, but mingle well with the flat-roofed stone houses of the town. In this convent we had to take up our abode. We longed to pitch our tents on the green below the town, but there was apprehension of rain, and it was thought better to go under the convent roof, which is truly a hospitable one. I do not know what it is about the services of this church which is so affecting to strangers, but I observe that all travelers speak of the strong emotions excited here. Few believe that the places under the church are what they are said to be. Few believe that the little caves shown by the monks are the kitchens and sitting room of the parents of Jesus, and that the spots marked out by the 2 granite pillars are those where Mary and the angel stood at the time of the Annunciation. I do not at all believe that these places were thus consecrated, yet I have seldom been so moved as I was this afternoon in the church of the Annunciation at Nazareth. We were at least in the place of residence of Jesus, and saw what he saw every day, the hollows of the valleys, the outline of the hills, and the streams in their courses, and the wild flowers which everywhere on the slopes spread underfoot. We were in the place which he called home. Entering the church with these impressions on our minds, we were saluted with a chant from a full choir, a chant sonorous, swelling, and exact, the best music, incomparably, that I heard abroad. It told upon our very hearts. Of course, we visited the rocky recesses below the church, which are called the abode of Joseph and Mary, and saw no reason to suppose that, while citizens of Nazareth, they lived in a grotto rather than a house. We were shown, too, a portrait of Jesus, which the monks believed to have been copied from an original taken in his lifetime, as if there had been a portrait painting of that kind in those days, and as if the Jews would have considered it lawful if they had. Such ignorance on the part of the monks prevents our relying on any tradition given by them, and I will therefore say nothing of the other places pointed out as sacred by them. Nazareth itself is sacred enough, and it is merely offensive to one's feelings to speak of some of the strange stories the monks tell and really believe about Jesus and his family in exhibiting what they declare to be the scenes of his life and daily actions. Right, let's take a quick look at Nazareth here. It's our next engraving. Beautiful image of Nazareth. Really nice and green. The next day, the uppermost feeling throughout was of delight at the thought of the natural beauty amidst which Jesus was reared. From the heights above the town we looked down into dells full of verdure, and abroad over the rich plain we had crossed the day before, and over towards Carmel, where we were going today. We rode among the hills for 2 hours, observing that clumps of forest trees became more frequent, and that the scenery was changing its character. And then we entered upon a tract which was so like the outskirts of an English nobleman's park that I could hardly believe that we were in the Holy Land. Rich grasses covered the slopes and levels, and clumps of ilex wooded every recess. We wound along under these clumps, and along the glades of the scattered forest, and up broken banks, and then again through reaches of checkered shade. And how could we help thinking that every step who had once been here before us? We were almost sorry to leave these park-like hills through we were descending into the plains of Zebulun, and Carmel was before us, and we were about to cross the old river Kishon, which Elijah knew so well when he lived in this region, and the blue sea was in sight. that sea from which Elijah's servant saw the cloud arise, which was no bigger than a man's hand. We rode at the foot of Carmel, keeping the river Kishon for the most part on the right hand. There could not be a finer place of assemblage than this plain for the children of Israel and the worshippers of the sun, Baal, when Elijah summoned them to meet. From the foot of Mount Carmel, which stands out boldly into the sea, the beach stretches northward in a fine sweep of 15 miles to Acre and the old Tyre. The plain of Zabulon, thus enclosed between the Galilean hills, Carmel, and the sea, held the assembled multitude on that great day. The worship of the sun was very imposing in all the countries where it subsisted. We have all heard of it as the worship of Apollo in Greece. I saw mighty temples to the same god under the name of Ra in Egypt and Nubia, and under the name of Baal at Baalbek, a few days' journey from this place at the foot of Carmel, where his hosts of priests were defied by Elijah. 1 Kings, 18, chapter 18, 1 Kings chapter 18. Here stood his 450 prophets, all in their pomp. Next, we ascended the mountain itself, and we spent 2 nights in the convent on its heights, so that the whole scene is well impressed on my memory. We went down the mountainside that afternoon to see the caves where the schools of prophets used to be, where the young men were gathered together to learn what was known of religion and to prepare themselves for its administration. Whether the principal cave was really thus occupied or not, some use was certainly made of it in ancient times. We found it a large square grotto, a spacious apartment in the mountainside, cool, shadowy, and solemn. All about its entrance and all over that side of the mountain, from the beach below to the convent on the height, was a perfect jungle of hollyhocks, ilex, odoriferous shrubs, herbs of many savors, and wildflowers as gay as the rainbow. Dry and drooping was all this vegetation when Elijah came hither at the end of the long drought, and cast himself down upon the earth while his servant watched on the ridge above. But oh, what an expanse of sky and of blue sea was there for the man's eye to range over while looking for a token of approaching rain. Today there was not in all the sky a cloud so big as a man's hand, but instead of a cloud there was, at the evening, the everlasting sign of the silver bow. When the sun had sunk beneath the waters and left a golden glow on both sea and sky, the young moon hung in the west, and yet a little while before the mild spring night veiled from my watching eyes the excellency of Carmel. We've got one last engraving here. Nice look. This is called Promontory of Mount Carmel.